Most people think sanctions happen quietly, on paper, in offices, through legal notices, but something very different is happening at sea. Ships are being stopped, crews are being boarded, oil is being physically taken, and almost no one is talking about how serious this really is. Welcome to the Strategic Geopolitics Brief, where we don't just follow headlines, we expose what they actually mean. This week, the United States seized its sixth oil tanker linked to Venezuela, and that single fact changes the entire picture. This is no longer economic pressure, this is enforcement. And enforcement at sea is the clearest sign that a financial war has crossed into physical space. The latest tanker was intercepted in Caribbean waters, quietly and without resistance. U.S. authorities say it was part of a network moving Venezuelan crude in violation of sanctions. No missiles, no explosions, just control. The ship, its cargo, and its future all gone in one move. And this wasn't the first. Before this seizure, 5 other tankers were already taken. Each one followed the same pattern. Opaque ownership, sudden flag changes, ship-to-ship transfers, and routes designed to erase origin. These were not random ships. Together, they formed what Washington openly calls a shadow fleet, a floating supply chain built to keep Venezuela's oil sector alive despite sanctions. The first seized tanker sent a warning. The second confirmed intent. By the third and fourth, it was clear the United States was mapping the entire network. The fifth showed coordination. And now the sixth makes something undeniable. This is a systematic campaign, not an isolated action. And here's the part most people miss. These seizures are not happening during chaos or war. They're happening deliberately under legal justifications to establish a new normal. The message isn't just for Venezuela. It's for ship owners, insurers, port authorities, traders, and buyers worldwide. If you touch sanctioned oil, the ocean is no longer neutral ground. At the same time this sixth tanker was seized, Venezuela's interim leadership made a carefully timed announcement. Promises of oil sector reform, opening doors to foreign investment, changing laws that force state control, signaling cooperation. On the surface, it looks like reform. Underneath, it looks like survival. Because Venezuela knows something critical. Oil without access is useless. You can pump it, but if you can't move it, insure it, or sell it safely, it becomes a liability instead of power. Every seized tanker tightens that reality. This is where the strategy becomes clear. The United States is not trying to collapse Venezuela overnight. It is squeezing the bloodstream of the economy while leaving just enough space for political restructuring. The seizures apply pressure without bombs. They enforce sanctions without speeches, and they quietly reshape who controls energy flows. What makes this moment even more important is precedent. If tankers can be seized this way today for Venezuela, the same logic can be applied tomorrow to any sanctioned state. The ocean, once governed by flags and distance, is becoming a monitored enforcement zone. And notice the silence. No dramatic announcements, no emergency summits. Because when power is confident, it doesn't need to shout, it acts. These 6 tankers together represent more than oil. They represent the collapse of workaround systems that many countries rely on. They signal that sanctions are no longer suggestions. They are physical barriers. This is not just about one country. This is about how economic warfare is evolving. Borders matter less. Shipping routes matter more. And whoever controls maritime enforcement controls the real pressure points of the global economy. So the next time you hear about another tanker seized, don't treat it as routine. Each one is a brick in a new global order where power is enforced not just through money or weapons, but through control of movement itself. And that is the real story unfolding beneath the waves. And the story doesn't end with the 6th tanker, because enforcement, once normalized, never stays limited. What happens next is where this quietly becomes dangerous. Each seizure lowers the political cost of the next one. What once required justification now requires routine paperwork. And when that threshold drops, the map of global trade starts changing without any announcement. Shipping companies are already reacting. Insurers are reassessing routes. Brokers are rewriting contracts. Ports are becoming selective not because they want to, but because they have to. A tanker doesn't need to be seized to be neutralized anymore. Sometimes the fear of seizure is enough to strand it before it ever sails. This is how pressure compounds, not through confrontation, but through hesitation. And there's another layer beneath this: timing. These seizures are happening as global energy markets are already tense, as supply chains are fragile, and as alternative producers struggle to scale fast enough. That means every barrel removed from informal circulation tightens leverage elsewhere. Prices don't just reflect supply, they reflect risk, and risk is now maritime. For Venezuela, this creates a narrowing corridor. Reform is no longer optional rhetoric, it's a bargaining chip. Oil sector reform is being spoken about not as an economic vision, but as a signal to Washington and investors that a different relationship might be possible. The message is subtle but clear. If the pressure eases, access can return. But here's the hard truth. Once enforcement begins, trust does not return easily. Even if laws change, even if leadership shifts, the memory of seizure lingers in boardrooms and shipping registries. Capital is cautious by nature, and maritime risk is among the fastest ways to scare it away. This is why the seizures matter far beyond Venezuela. They demonstrate something structural. The U.S. doesn't need universal cooperation to enforce sanctions anymore. It only needs control over enough choke points, insurance, ports, payment systems, and patrol zones to make defiance unprofitable. And once that model works, it spreads. Other sanctioned states are watching closely, not with outrage, but with calculation. They're measuring how much deniability remains, how long shadow fleets can survive, how deep maritime enforcement can realistically go. Because what's being tested here isn't Venezuela's resilience, it's the limits of global tolerance. And the ocean, once a buffer between powers, is now becoming the arena where those limits are tested quietly. No speeches, no declarations, just ships that disappear from circulation. This is how 21st century power operates, not by occupying territory, but by interrupting movement, not by conquering states, but by controlling flows. Oil, goods, money, data, all move through systems, and systems once mapped can be constrained. So when you see another tanker seized, understand what's really happening. You're watching the rehearsal of a world where economic rules are enforced physically, selectively, and far from public view. A world where geopolitics doesn't explode, it tightens. And as this tightening continues, something else begins to shift. Behavior. Not headlines, not speeches, behavior. Because power doesn't need everyone to comply, it only needs enough actors to quietly change course. One insurer raises premiums. One port delays clearance. One shipping firm decides a route isn't worth the exposure. And suddenly an entire trade lane starts drying up without a single official ban. That's the invisible impact of these tanker seizures. Every ship taken sends ripples through databases, risk models, and compliance teams. Vessels that once moved freely now trigger alerts. Ownership structures are scrutinized. Flag hopping becomes less effective. The gray zone that shadow fleets rely on starts shrinking. And this is where the strategy shows its sophistication. The United States isn't chasing every barrel of oil. It doesn't need to. It's targeting enough examples to poison the well of plausibility, to make everyone else ask, what if we're next? For Venezuela, this accelerates a dilemma that has been building for years. The state can claim sovereignty, it can condemn seizures, it can promise reform. But sovereignty loses leverage when movement is constrained. Oil sitting in the ground has value. Oil stuck at sea has risk. And oil seized mid-route becomes a warning symbol. That's why the interim leadership's reform message matters. It's not aimed at domestic audiences, it's aimed outward, at capital, at regulators, at governments that want stability more than ideology. Reform language is a signal flare, not a policy yet. But signals only work if someone is willing to respond. And here's the deeper question most analysts avoid. What happens if the response never comes? What if enforcement continues regardless of reform promises? What if this becomes the default posture toward any state labeled non-compliant? Then the world changes quietly. Because at that point, maritime law stops being neutral ground and becomes an extension of financial policy. The distinction between economic pressure and physical control dissolves. And once that line is crossed, it rarely moves back. We've seen this before in history. Blockades without declarations, restrictions without wars, pressure applied until systems collapse internally. What's different now is the precision. Modern surveillance, data tracking, and legal frameworks allow control without chaos. Ships are stopped cleanly, crews are unharmed, markets absorb the shock slowly, which makes it sustainable. And sustainable pressure is far more powerful than dramatic force. This is why there's no rush to escalate, no rush to announce victory, because the objective isn't spectacle, it's adjustment. To force a recalibration of how trade is done, who it's done with, and under what conditions. And as long as the seizures continue, every global shipping actor is learning the same lesson. Neutrality is no longer passive. It must be proven. So this isn't just about Venezuela's oil or America's enforcement. It's about a future where control over movement becomes the primary currency of power, where ships, not soldiers, define leverage. And once that future settles in, it doesn't announce itself. It simply becomes normal. And that's when geopolitics becomes most dangerous, and not when it explodes, but when it stops making noise. And to understand just how deliberate this campaign has become, you have to look at all 6 tanker seizures together, not as isolated incidents, but as stages in a single operation. The first tanker was seized quietly, almost experimentally. It was presented as a straightforward sanctions enforcement action, a ship moving Venezuelan crude through indirect routes. At the time, many observers treated it as symbolic, a one-off meant to remind everyone that U.S. sanctions still existed. But symbolism wasn't the point. Mapping was. The second tanker confirmed intent. It showed that the first was not a warning shot, but a test run. Similar patterns appeared again. Complex ownership structures, recently changed flags, ship-to-ship transfers designed to blur origin. By the second seizure, it became clear the United States was not guessing, it was tracking. The third tanker shifted perception. This seizure demonstrated coordination between agencies and legal preparedness. The boarding was clean, the justification was ready, and most importantly, there was no diplomatic hesitation. That's when shipping insurers began quietly reevaluating coverage linked to Venezuelan routes. The fourth tanker expanded the scope. It showed that distance didn't matter, that rerouting didn't matter, and that time didn't erase liability. By this point, the idea of a safe corridor for sanctioned oil had effectively collapsed. Shadow fleets rely on ambiguity, and ambiguity was being removed piece by piece. The fifth tanker made the strategy undeniable. 5 seizures is not coincidence. It is doctrine. By then, the U.S. had demonstrated endurance, legal confidence, and international tolerance. No major backlash, no coalition breakdown. The world absorbed it, which strategically was the most important signal of all. And now the sixth tanker closes the loop. This one doesn't add novelty, it adds finality. It confirms that this approach is sustainable, that enforcement will continue as long as the network exists, and that no single ship, owner, or intermediary is too small or too indirect to escape attention. Together, these 6 tankers tell one story. The Shadow Fleet model is being dismantled sequentially, not disrupted randomly. Each seizure removes not just oil, but trust. Trust in flags, trust in paperwork, trust in distance. Because once the 6th tanker is gone, the illusion of resilience disappears. The system that allowed oil to move quietly no longer functions. What remains is choice: adapt politically or remain isolated economically. This is also why the United States doesn't need to announce a blockade. A blockade invites confrontation. What's happening instead is selective enforcement that achieves the same effect without triggering formal escalation. Ships still sail, just not for sanctioned oil. Routes still exist, just not for risky cargo. The ocean remains open but conditional. Other countries are studying this carefully, not because they sympathize with Venezuela, but because they see a blueprint, a method of control that relies on data, law, and persistence rather than force. A model where power is applied quietly until resistance becomes inefficient. This is how modern pressure works. It doesn't break systems overnight, it makes them too costly to maintain. So when you hear 6 tankers seized, Understand what that number represents. It represents the point at which denial becomes impossible, at which workaround becomes liability, at which reform stops being a slogan and starts being a necessity. And this is why this story matters far beyond the Caribbean, because the same seas carry the same ships for everyone. And once enforcement becomes routine, no shadow stays safe for long. And once you step back and look at this pattern in full, another reality comes into focus. This campaign is not actually about oil volumes at all. The amount of crude on 6 tankers matters far less than what those seizures do to confidence, legality, and momentum. Every tanker that was seized carried more than oil. It carried assumptions. The assumption that enforcement would be selective. The assumption that distance creates safety. The assumption that complexity equals protection. One by one, those assumptions were stripped away. The early seizures attacked plausibility. The middle seizures attacked logistics. The latest one attacks psychology, because now anyone still involved in this trade has to believe they are smarter than an entire enforcement system that has already proven patience, visibility, and reach. That belief gets rarer with every interception. And here's the quiet genius of it. The United States doesn't need to prove it sees everything. It only needs to prove it sees enough to make participation irrational. This is why there's no rush to announce totals, publish ship names loudly, or escalate rhetoric. The objective isn't humiliation, it's normalization. To make seizure feel procedural, to make resistance feel inefficient. For Venezuela, this is devastating in a very specific way. Not dramatic collapse, but strategic exhaustion. Oil revenues don't vanish overnight. They thin, they delay, they leak away through higher costs, longer routes, risk premiums, and lost buyers. Eventually, production itself becomes pointless because moving the product becomes harder than extracting it. And notice how carefully worded those reform signals are. They don't promise transformation, they promise openness. They don't reject state control outright. They hint at flexibility. This is not bold policy, it's bargaining language. Language used when leverage is gone, but dignity still matters. Meanwhile, every other energy producer is watching and learning a separate lesson. That compliance now includes behavior at sea. That sanctions aren't just about contracts or banks anymore, they're about routes, registries, and real-time tracking. That maritime neutrality is no longer passive, it's conditional on alignment. This changes how future sanctions will work. Why threaten secondary penalties when you can intercept cargo directly? Why negotiate endlessly when movement itself can be interrupted? The tools are cleaner, quieter, and more effective than traditional pressure. And because they're quiet, they're harder to resist politically. There's no invasion to protest, no bombing to condemn, just enforcement of rules that already exist, applied with confidence. This is why this moment matters so deeply. It signals a shift from symbolic power to operational power, from warning to action, from theoretical leverage to physical control. And once that shift happens, it doesn't reverse easily. The ocean becomes a filter. Not everything passes through anymore, only what aligns. So when people ask whether this is escalation, the answer is more unsettling. It's stabilization. Stabilization of a new enforcement model, stabilization of a new risk environment, stabilization of a world where pressure doesn't arrive loudly, it arrives steadily. That's why this story feels quiet but heavy, why it doesn't trend explosively but reshapes reality underneath, and why the 6th tanker matters more than the first ever did. Because 6 is not an experiment, 6 is policy. And once policy moves offshore, it changes the map for everyone. And when policy reaches this stage, the consequences stop being immediate and start becoming structural. Because once enforcement becomes routine, it reshapes incentives permanently. Future ship owners don't need to lose a tanker to feel the pressure. They price the risk in advance. Future traders don't need to be sanctioned. They self-exclude. Future governments don't need to be warned. They quietly adjust their behavior to avoid becoming the next test case. This is how power becomes efficient, and this is where the Venezuelan case turns into a reference model rather than an exception. The 6 seized tankers now exist as case studies inside compliance manuals, insurance risk algorithms, and maritime law briefings. Their routes are studied, their mistakes are cataloged, Their ownership trails are dissected. Every lesson extracted from them makes the next seizure easier or unnecessary, because the ultimate goal of enforcement is not seizure, it's deterrence, and deterrence is now working. That silence is the clearest indicator of success. For Venezuela, this produces a narrowing future. Oil reform becomes less about growth and more about re-entry, not into prosperity, but into legitimacy, to be insurable again, to be financeable again, to be routable again. And legitimacy once lost is far harder to regain than revenue. This is why these seizures matter even if oil prices barely move. Markets respond to flow, but systems respond to precedent. And precedent is what's being written here. At the same time, other powers are quietly stress testing their own exposure. Which routes would be vulnerable? Which fleets rely on ambiguity? Which legal defenses would actually hold if challenged? This isn't paranoia, it's adaptation, because everyone understands now that sanctions enforcement has entered a new phase, one where distance no longer guarantees safety and complexity no longer guarantees cover. That's why this moment is easy to underestimate. But history shows that the most consequential shifts rarely announce themselves. They embed, they normalize, they quietly redraw the boundaries of what's possible. That's the pattern unfolding here. Slow, deliberate, and extremely hard to reverse. And as this tightening continues, another consequence begins to surface: normalization at the institutional level. Maritime enforcement doesn't stay ad hoc for long. Once procedures are tested and refined, they get codified. Rules turn into checklists. Checklists turn into routine operations, and eventually entire bureaucracies are built around what once seemed extraordinary. That's where this is heading. The seizure of the first tanker required explanation. The second required justification. By the sixth, it required neither. It followed an established pattern, an accepted authority, and an expectation of compliance. That's how power settles in, not through repetition alone, but through predictability. For shipping companies, predictability changes everything. It doesn't matter whether they politically agree with sanctions. What matters is whether exposure can be managed. And right now, exposure linked to Venezuelan crude cannot be reliably managed. That single calculation removes more barrels from circulation than any single seizure ever could. This is why shadow fleets fail in the long run. They depend on uncertainty. Once uncertainty is replaced by expectation, the entire model collapses under its own cost. And that collapse doesn't just affect Venezuela. It sends a signal across the entire global south. Economic sovereignty in the modern era is inseparable from access to global systems. Shipping, insurance, finance, and law lose access to one, and the others start to close automatically. That's the unspoken power of these seizures. They weaponize interdependence. And that's also why no dramatic escalation is needed. The system itself does the work. But reintegration has a price, and that price is alignment. This is the quiet bargain being offered, not just to Venezuela, but to any state watching this unfold. Align enough to move. Deviate too far, and movement becomes friction. Friction becomes delay. Delay becomes isolation. This is why the ocean matters so much in this story. It's the physical layer beneath globalization. Control it, and you don't need to control territory. You control access. That's what makes these tanker seizures so strategic. They don't occupy land, they occupy pathways. And pathways, once constrained, reshape behavior far more efficiently than force ever could. So when this story continues, and it will, don't expect a climax. Expect continuation. More routine actions, more quiet adjustments, more normalization. And once systems settle, they don't ask permission. They harden. Oil doesn't vanish. Trade doesn't end. It reroutes toward whoever can still move freely. That means compliant producers gain leverage without producing a single extra barrel. It means sanctioned producers lose relevance even if their reserves remain untouched. Power shifts not because of force, but because of access. This is the silent redistribution happening beneath these tanker seizures. For Venezuela, the consequences stretch far beyond the immediate loss of ships. Every seizure degrades future bargaining power, because when enforcement is proven, promises sound weaker. Reform proposals arrive late, and late reform is never negotiated from strength. It's negotiated from necessity. That's why timing matters so much here. If reform had come before the network was dismantled, it might have looked proactive. Coming after 6 tankers have been seized, it looks reactive. And in geopolitics, reaction is always more expensive than initiative. At the same time, this campaign teaches a lesson to everyone else. The era of plausible deniability at sea is ending. AIS manipulation, flag switching, shell companies, these used to buy time. Now they buy attention. And attention is exactly what enforcement systems are built to act on. What's emerging is a world where maritime data is as politically sensitive as financial data, where ship movement is treated like a transaction, logged, evaluated, approved, or intercepted. This also explains why there's no rush to formalize any of this in dramatic declarations. Formalization invites resistance. Normalization invites compliance. The more boring enforcement becomes, the more effective it is. That's why the most dangerous moment in geopolitics is not escalation, it's acceptance. The moment when everyone quietly agrees that this is how things work now. And that moment is approaching fast, because after 6 tankers, the question is no longer, can this be done? The question becomes, who will be next and under what justification? And when that question starts circulating privately in shipping offices, legal firms, insurance boards, and ministries, behavior changes faster than policy ever could. So don't look for a dramatic endpoint to this story. There won't be one. The seizures will either continue until resistance collapses, or they'll stop because deterrence has already worked. And when they stop, it won't feel like victory. It will feel like silence. That's the hallmark of a system that has succeeded. And when silence finally sets in, it doesn't mean the pressure is gone. It means the pressure has been internalized. At that stage, enforcement no longer needs ships or patrols to do most of the work. It lives inside decisions, inside contracts that never get signed, inside routes that never get approved, inside cargoes that never leave port. Power migrates from action to anticipation. That's the end game of what we're watching, because once 6 tankers have been taken, every future actor assumes a 7th is possible. And that assumption alone is enough to reshape the system. No announcement is required. No deadline is set. The market disciplines itself. This is why Venezuela's situation becomes so revealing. The country isn't running out of oil. It's running out of options, options to move quietly, options to test boundaries, options to delay alignment. And when options disappear, politics follows economics, not the other way around. What looks like reform language is really a signal of compression, political space shrinking under logistical pressure. When a state can no longer move its most valuable resource freely, every internal decision becomes externally constrained. Sovereignty remains on paper, but leverage does not. And here's the part that's rarely said out loud. This model works best precisely because it avoids spectacle. There's no rallying cry against it, no single moment to resist, just a gradual adjustment that becomes irreversible. That's why these tanker seizures don't provoke dramatic retaliation. There's nothing obvious to retaliate against. No border crossed, no city struck, just rules enforced calmly and consistently. And consistency is the real signal here. Once enforcement shows consistency, the question stops being whether it's legal or fair. The question becomes whether it's avoidable. And increasingly, the answer is no. That realization spreads quietly, first among insurers, then among ship owners, then among traders, then among governments. Each layer adjusts, and by the time public debate catches up, the structure has already changed. This is how maritime space is being rewritten, not as a battlefield, but as a gatekeeping system. And gatekeeping systems don't announce themselves. They operate, they filter, they decide who moves and who waits. So when we extend this story forward, the most likely future isn't escalation. It's stabilization around a new normal. Fewer seizures, not because enforcement failed, but because resistance faded. Fewer headlines, not because the issue was resolved, but because compliance replaced defiance. That's when the real victory, from an enforcement perspective, is achieved. Not when the last tanker is seized, but when no one dares to send one. And that is the point this story is quietly moving toward. And that's the real update, brought to you here on Strategic Geopolitics Brief, where we don't chase headlines, we decode what they truly mean.